Welcome to the conversation on the TYT network. We got a great guest for you guys. Now, Candice Mallet is a journalist and columnist. She has worked at Blavity, KPFK, The New Inquiry, and she's also at Teen Vogue now. So, Candice, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to have you. So you wrote a couple of really interesting pieces. So in mainstream media, unity and bipartisanship is the gold standard. They think it doesn't really matter what we're agreeing to as long as everyone in Washington agrees. They're ecstatic about it. You're challenging that idea. So first, let's just talk about why. Why shouldn't Biden do unity with the Republicans and bring the country together?
I mean, because it's at what's at cost, right? So usually progressive issues are usually what kind of gets thrown and tossed aside in the sake of unity. And there's principles. And I think you have to think about what you're compromising in the sake of unity and what is really the point. And so if you want, to be in unity with people who are against taking, aggressive action against climate crisis, against, making sure that people have some sort of universal basic income while they're going through this pandemic, and who have been attacking, the Affordable Care Act, which is the bare minimum, the government can do for healthcare, then I would be concerned in why people elected you in the first place.
So there's two different and difficult things that we've got to deal with in the Biden years. And over the last couple of days, couple of weeks, I've been talking about how I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't say that often. So one is when Biden does what he always does, he thinks we're still in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and he's gonna make deals with Mitch McConnell. And those, if you're gonna make a deal with Mitch McConnell, Candice, as you point out, it's going to be a terrible deal. It's not gonna be a deal that, it's not about whether progressives like it or not. It will be disastrous for the country. Almost every deal that Biden and McConnell have ever struck over these last 40 years has been a disaster. Whether it was the '94 crime bill, whether it was the deal to make the Bush tax cuts permanent for the rich, and we can go on and on. When that happens, normally all of the media goes, yes, oh my God, we're so happy you all got robbed because bipartisanship is the only thing that matters. But now progressives are not going to stand for it. But what form do you think that takes? What does that rebellion look like? And what does it lead to?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw a bit of it already, right? The unrest that took place at the end of May and in June and just kind of throughout the summer was, definitely because of the police violence that was happening, but also, if you look at the people who were arrested, they were people who were impacted by the pandemic. And so there is, people are economically, they're hurting right now. And so if we go into another 4 years with a government who continues to ignore us, it'd be kind of similar to what happened under Obama's first term, where we had Occupy. You had people in the streets challenging, the call for austerity. And I think people are going to challenge that, and they need to, because if not, we're just going to continue this cycle of, one bad corporatist to another bad corporatist. And we actually need something way bigger than just a, change in party. We need systemic change.
So Candice, I don't know if they'll do it to you, but I know that in my career for the last 18 years, whenever I've said, yeah, no, we shouldn't do that deal, that's bad. And whether it was standing up to Clinton, Obama, it doesn't matter. You can stand up to Republicans, that's different, right? But if you stand up to Biden, the media will savage you. They'll call you a radical, the worst of the worst, et cetera. I don't know. I've dealt with that my whole life. What do you like? Do you think that they will do that to young folks like yourself, a progressive movement that is much larger, an African American movement that is larger and stronger in a lot of ways than has been the case in the last couple of decades? And then if they do, what do you think happens at that point?
I mean, you kind of already see it happening with the defund the police movement. They're starting to kind of like distance themselves away from it. And it's, an opportunity for them to also kind of distance themselves away from the unrest and the protests that have been happening that, I think they see as a dividing factor between them gaining more Republicans or conservative people into the party, which is true. And so, yeah, like they'll just kind of continue to distance themselves. And yeah, I definitely think people who speak out about Biden are going to get criticism. We already saw that happening before the election for people who were like, actually, I don't want to have to vote for the lesser of two evils. I want something better. I deserve something better. And so, yeah, you're going to have a continuation of that for the next 4 years, unfortunately. But I think the key is, to kind of recognize the Democratic Party for what they are and what they tell you to be. And I think it's interesting that, you have Democrats who continue sort of like, push away the progressive ideas and kind of like talk down to the progressive wing of the party. And progressives kind of just continue this relationship with them. And I'm wondering why, if the Democrats aren't serving the needs of what your, interests are or policies that you want to see happen, then maybe it's time to either form a new party or, question the idea of, the two-party system completely.
Yeah, so I want to get to how we take power because, so for our progressive allies in Congress, I told them that trying to work with corporate Democrats was never going to work, right? And they were going to betray you the minute they got an opportunity because they're not your friends. They're pretending to be your friends, but they're not. They work for the donors. And so the minute we won the election, by the way, on the strength of what? Young people showed up at much greater rates than historically they normally do. And African Americans in Atlanta, Philly, Milwaukee, and all the places that Donald Trump is now yelling about, Detroit, et cetera. So as soon as we were done being useful, they immediately blamed us. And you wrote about that in your pieces. And so, and I think that was kind of a bit of an awakening for the AOCs and the Rashida Tlaibs. Oh, they're not going to work with us. Now, but then we get into the intractable problem of starting a third party is enormously difficult, massively expensive. And that's our number one problem is we don't have enough money. And so what do we do then at that point in how to fight back in a way that's effective that gains us the results that we want?
I mean, yes, I think having an opposition party to the Democrats that aren't the Republicans is going to be a difficult task. But at what point, do you take that task, right? Like if you want electoral politics and you want to have, your ideas represented in your government, then at what point do you kind of just recognize that like that's not going to be able to happen in the Democratic Party, at least not anytime soon, right? I mean, you are seeing more progressive people take House seats, but we really don't have time to sit and try to turn over the Democratic Party when we have the climate crisis happening right now. And so we need drastic measures to happen, whether that's people, realizing that in 4 years from now, either Biden or, Kamala Harris, depending on if Biden only plans to run for one term, is going to run. And so if someone wants to be the progressive challenger to that, they should be starting their campaign now and not waiting until a year before that, the year before the election. And that also just means like organizing and, building up our own community sort of networks and having mutual aid, having neighborhood assemblies, kind of taking away the power that we depend so much on the government and like empowering ourselves to have that, I think is also a tactic that, is being utilized and can be utilized in a larger level.
Yeah, no, I know the first step. The minute you propose things like that, the rest of the media will yell at you at the top of their lungs. It's less the corporate Democrats we have to worry about than the mainstream media, because the mainstream media despises anything that doesn't call for unity and bipartisanship. I don't know what happens next though, because yelling at me is easy. I think yelling at a whole new young generation is a little more difficult than they realize. But I want to ask about one last thing as quickly as we can. You wrote in one of your pieces Biden's call for a united America boils down to nationalist propaganda. That's really interesting. Tell us what you mean by that.
So, the idea of this America where we're all united is part of like the myth of America. Because if you look at from the existence of, genocide of indigenous people in this country, from the enslavement of African people, there was not unity of the people who those people were not unified in the idea of America. They were, subjected to it. And so this idea is just like one American is part of the nationalist idea of, us being one. And that's important to nationalism because that feeds into, whenever we go to wars and pushing that idea, or sort of the sake of creating one and all together. And I think challenging that, sort of looking at unity as nationalism, or at least a try for that, kind of makes you question well, what does it mean to have unity in this country? What do we give up? And do we want that? What are my principles? If I'm someone who's an abolitionist, do I want to be unified with people who, believe in having the prison system, or who believe in capitalism?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then no.
Yeah, I want people to understand it as we go here that Candace is saying things that are very similar to what Frederick Douglass said. And at the time, the media and the so-called left movement, or the people that were in charge in the left back then, told Frederick Douglass, no, we gotta go for unity. And he's like, you want me to unify with who? The slaveholder? And their idea was, no, you're doing it wrong. You're calling for rebellions from time to time, and that's unacceptable. He's like, no, slavery is unacceptable. And so this call for unity is not a new trick. It's a very old trick, because no one ever asks, and this is why I get so mad at the mainstream media, unify behind what? Behind what? And if you say unify behind slavery, as they did to Frederick Douglass, our answer is, we're on air, so I'll go with hell no, okay? And if you say unify now behind more tax cuts for the rich and more of the disaster that we've had in this country for the last 40, 50 years, the answer is no. And so what happens after that is anybody's guess. But Candace Mallet, really interesting pieces. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. 2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.